One of the cell organelles that we need to discuss a little bit more in detail is the cell membrane, and that is because it carries out active and passive transport and also osmosis. So that is what this slideshow is going to cover. The cell membrane is also called the gatekeeper of the cell because it controls what goes into and out of the cell. The main components of the cell membrane are proteins and phospholipids. If you remember from the last slideshow, the cell membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So in diffusion, the molecules kind of spread out, and this type of movement does not require energy. So you can see in that bottom right-hand corner, if ink was placed in those beakers, it would eventually diffuse so that all of the water would be infiltrated by those molecules of the ink. You can see the back pictures are actual pictures of that occurring, and then the front pictures are just animations of that. Osmosis is diffusion across the membrane, and that is specifically related to water. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. That means it's going to decide what comes in and what goes out. So water is something that can move freely across the membrane. That link there, I'm not sure if you can click on it right now, but we'll take a look at that in class at our next meeting. The number one rule to remember for osmosis is that salt sucks. So if the area outside of the cell has a higher salt concentration than the area inside the cell, then the salt will actually pull water out of the cell, or if the concentration is higher inside the cell, the salt will pull the water into the cell. Iso means the same. So if we're talking about an isotonic solution, that means that everything is balanced inside and outside of the cell. So the water will travel in both directions across the cell membrane, and it will be equal. Hypo means less. So if we're looking at a hypotonic solution, that means there's less salt located outside the cell than inside the cell, which means that because salt sucks, it will move water into the cell membrane. This could cause the cell to burst, but there are some cells that have organelles called contractile vacuoles. So those will actually push the water out of the cell if there's too much coming in. Hyper means more. So if we're talking about a hypertonic solution, that means there's more salt outside of the cell. Water's going to move out of the cell because it's going to be attracted to those salt molecules, which means that the cell will shrink or die, or plant cells in this case could wilt. This is why it's very dangerous to drink salt water or to ingest too much salt, because it can cause your cells to become hypertonic and die. Hyper means more. So if we're talking about a hypertonic solution, that means there's more salt outside of the cell than inside. So salt will be sucked out of the cell, and this can cause the cell to shrink or die, or plant cells in this case might wilt. Passive transport requires no energy. So passive transport includes diffusion and osmosis. Facilitated diffusion is when proteins help the molecules across the membrane. You can see in that bottom right-hand picture, those are protein channels. So those protein channels will actually help the larger molecules go through that can't go through that lipid bilayer. But remember, diffusion is, even if it's facilitated, is still called passive transport because it doesn't require energy from the cell. Active transport, on the other hand, does require energy. So active transport occurs in the protein pumps that are found throughout the cell membrane. That's another facet of those proteins that are embedded in that cell membrane. So molecules of this type have to be moved across the cell membrane using energy. And that energy, remember, comes in the form of ATP, which is generated by the mitochondria.